Hello, welcome everybody to our Typology Talks conference. I think Oliver will give an introduction.
Yes, hello, good afternoon. My name is Oliver Till. To be honest, for us, it's a little bit confusing situation because it's actually the first digital conference we organize by ourselves. But anyway, we are very happy to have you all here to our first annual Typology Talks conference from Studio Campetil at the Leibniz University in Hanover. And the topic of this afternoon will be the question of learning landscapes. That means the question of how to design and how to use university buildings. And let's say we have here at the school a 3-year program related to buildings for education. And what we actually try to do is within our 3-year course to, on one hand, understand the history of the development of buildings for education. So we start basically at least in the Renaissance and try to follow, let's say, the historical development of this type. And by doing so, we try to understand the, let's say, the impact of society on the development of these typologies. And what we actually do is that the students in our course do analysis of, let's say, existing buildings for education, and we try to understand how these buildings have been designed, how they are used, and how they also react on changes that happen while let's say the buildings are used. And what we are really interesting is, let's say, in this project to understand why the buildings are designed the way they look. And we try to understand how we can design buildings that on one hand, let's say, you can say adapt and react on social change, but also at the same time also stimulate social change and new forms of education. And let's say the main question we are always dealing with is the fact that, let's say, you design a building for at least 50 or 100 years for a future that we all don't know, but we have to prepare buildings to, let's say, changes that happen in the education landscape. And in order to understand this question better, we invited a free guest to our conference, and these are Pete Eckhart from A2A from Zurich, the first speaker, and Pete studied at the ETH in Zurich and also at the Columbia University in New York. And before starting his own office in 2001, he worked for a couple of years for OMA in Rotterdam. And he's not only running an architecture office, but is also teach also at several universities and is at the moment teaching as a full professor together with Wim Eckhart at the school in Dortmund. And we invited Pete because they relatively recently won 2 competitions for education buildings, one in Bremen and one in Basel, that we think are really worth to discuss within this conference. The second speaker is Kees Kahn from the very well-known office Kahn in Rotterdam. Kees was born in 1961 and studied at the TU Delft. And he is now also teaching since already, I think, 15 years at TU Delft as a full professor. And the Kahn office realized a lot of inspiring education buildings in Europe, but also outside Europe. And just to name a few, the office worked at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam and at the university in Tilburg, recently won a competition in Groningen for an education building, and realized two projects in France, one in Saclay, I think, and one in Lille, and but also worked on two university projects in Brazil. And last speakers of today's conference is Shelly Mcnamara from Grafton in Dublin, a very well-known office that already exists. I couldn't actually find the exactly date when the office was founded. That maybe we will hear that soon. But Shelly, what we found out, Shelly at least studied in Dublin, used to teach, among other universities, at the EPFL in Lausanne and in Harvard, and is currently working as a professor at the school in Mendrisio. And Grafton is very well known, especially for the education buildings that the office realized all, let's say, over Europe, but also outside Europe, especially the school in Milan, the university building in Lima, the London School of Economics in London, a big university building in Saclay, and a building for the Kingston University in London. And last but not least, I would like to mention that Grafton won in 2020 the Pritzker Prize for architecture. So, and I think now we can start with our first speaker.
So that's me, I think. I'm trying to share now my screen, if this is the plan. Just give me a second. So I hope you see this. At least the title. Okay, very good. Well, first of all, thank you, Oliver and Andre, for inviting me for this symposium. I mean, it's a pleasure to create an input for your discussion, and I'm trying to do this now in kind of a compact 30 minutes. To think broadly about education, about typologies, architectural typologies that sustain educational program, I think it becomes clear that learning is always related to a political agenda, and is also very often related to an ideological aspiration. And I'm trying to not only show two projects, one built and one in the development that has been mentioned, but also trying to relate a bit into a meta context of this discussion, so to inspire a bit our upcoming discussions in the sense what goes beyond the physical presence of the context that we are operating in, but how are we actually linking into ideological or political context that goes along with the question of how to educate ourselves as a society. So this is one kind of issue about my input, and the other is, of course, if you design an educational building, you also, as an architect, you also relate to your own autobiographical experiences, which is normal because experience and emotion is very much related to the way we design our buildings. And actually go maybe into a first experiential pretext in this lecture talk about what we have experienced so far in this discussion or in our own curriculum. And last but not least, your questions about typologies are very much also linked to program, as Oliver has mentioned, with the rising of a number of questions. And I find it very interesting that there's a kind of a paradox to talk about or to discuss about program and typologies, because a strong typology somehow makes itself independent from the program. So, so there is a kind of potential redundancy in it, which maybe we come back to this issue. So let's start. This is a photo taken exactly at the moment when I was born. It was 68 summer. And it is a photo from the 68 movements that has taken place at a provisional building right in the center of Zurich. It was a provisional building that was originally generated for a grocery store while that was under construction. And the ETH took over these provisional spaces to house their drafting areas. And it was quite an impressive period of time where Aldo Rossi and John Haydock at the same time taught at the ETH. So it was very much loaded condition and of talent, and it shows that the space that was available were actually used for the first assemblies of the protest movements of the 68. And it was also related because the ETH housed these functions or the drafting spaces, the workspaces of the architectural school in that area, because at the same time there was the campus under construction. And I found it very interesting because later I came to this site and I found these images, these blurry images, very interesting because it looks like a montage. Seemingly the campus is very disconnected from the city, it's sitting really on the hill. For those of you, and most of you that have experienced that area, it is fairly disconnected from the city. And it, of course, was also linked to this ideological split between, to get basically the activities of the students out of the city into a kind of a controlled area of a campus. So it was also very much linked with this ideological consequence of the upcoming protest movement. The architectural department where I've been trained is here. You see my cursor. And I found it very, very intriguing that the first experiences of my training was that, let's say, the architecture that we were housed in to be taught architecture was so extremely generic that the only way to kind of survive was to become really specific in the work. So there was a kind of a paradox between what the environment was and how we were conceiving architecture as a student, or how our teachers were insisting in the specificity of our design. So I found that this is one of a kind of open experience, or first experience of my work, or of my curriculum, so to speak. And later in Columbia, I experienced absolutely opposite. You know, the idea of the campus of Columbia University was part of the city. Basically, was a city block. Had the intensity of Manhattan, and at the same time was only consisting of character buildings, so to speak, identities, so to speak, whether it was a classic or even a postmodern expression of it. But the experience from the technical university that we had from Switzerland was completely encountered with a different model. So one of the epicenters was this building, which is the Avery. You know the Avery, and the Avery, which is the architectural library, is the epicenter basically of the meet-in of architectural education at Columbia University. And the architectural expression was absolutely the opposite, as I said. Like, so it was a kind of signified in a way as an institutional architecture, the role of this building was a fundamental different role to the one of the technical universities in Europe. The students were not present here, but the students were working all spread over Manhattan or even greater, and you went there to meet each other. So it was a kind of a melting pot or a meeting. It was never related to the work, but it was related to debate, research, or meeting or lectures. So I find that quite impressive as a model, and also in terms of the plan, the specificity was fundamentally different as an experience. Coming as a trained architect into the role of a teacher, we spent many years in Mendrisio, as Shelly best knows here. And I find this image also very indicative, because I had this incredible pleasure to be able to teach in the Torconi, in the Palazzo Torconi, which is here in the foreground, which is in the lower end of the image. And it was this juxtaposition between an architecture that was as found, so to speak, as the school was related to its first steps, and there was an architecture that later was implemented, designed as an educational building. And what we experienced with the Palazzo Torconi was that the interesting fact is it was the hospital of Mendrisio, and the hospital just moved out. You just see it on the right side, and it got transformed as an architectural school. And meanwhile, the process of renewal has taken over, and it becomes the kind of new architectural library of the Academia in Mendrisio. So what this experience, what do we draw out of it? Also here we are facing a kind of almost a monumental architecture, or it was one of the very, very few classicist architecture in the Ticino. And it is an architecture that basically just had two components in its own typological expression. And you see this really well in the section. You have this terrific aisle that is very high and very continuous, and it has an adjacency of space that you could say are individual halls, the drafting spaces, the computer spaces, mold spaces, and everything, the entire universal meeting is happening in the aisle. So this is where people kiss, this is where people are reviewed, this is where the work is being exhibited. And the relevance of the adjacent spaces was very relaxed. Yeah? So, and I found this, maybe it's a kind of key conclusion if we talk about strong typologies, that we are not only talking about spaces, but also strategies that these typologies are generating in terms of the question, what is important as a space and what maybe is less of importance. And this is where we teach today. This is some early images from the South Campus. So the Technical University Dortmund is a huge university compared to the previous ones. And this was in the 60s, where they built the South Campus with all provisional buildings. And of course, the 60s now is related in Germany with the building reformation and the access of much a broader society to higher education. And you see some images how the buildings were extremely quickly built. And again, had this kind of link of early experiences that we had in the ETH, but this time much clearer in the sense of its organizational qualities. So you see, like, obviously, where spaces are adjacent or where there's a meeting point. So it's a very simple, very robust typological expression of architecture, which from my own experience now really works well. So, and in 2007, we all knew that something happened profoundly. The introduction of the iPhone by Steve Jobs caused basically a fundamental revolution in the media age. Everything became different in terms of communication, in terms of accessing knowledge, and what used to be, in a way, a very collective experience of information was related to the one single content as an experience. And today we experience, as a consequence of this introduction, a simultaneous condition of program while having a collective experience. So it's a fundamental shift to a different relation to access, information, and communication at the same time. And it doesn't mean by any matters that the collectivity, the aspect of the collectivity, is then denied. So it is a different sort of meeting. And what becomes interesting is content becomes choosable, so to speak. So you can, as an individual, design your own content or compose your own programmatic content. So I found that very interesting, but also in media age, where what used to be one big studio and a few offices around, it had an impact in the architecture as well. So today, in broadcasting, in the media type of building, so in terms of what this communication of knowledge impacts as an architectural issue, is that office and studio is everywhere. So it's almost an atomizing process of spreading and creating anywhere opportunities. So I find this a very interesting excursus if you really talk about the development of educational building typologies. As Oliver mentioned, we are currently planning a new university building in Bremen, and what you see is the master plan from Gottfried Böhm, a very important architect in Germany. It was a master plan done in the 60s under the premises of Freie Universität. Yeah? So this the founding in Germany of Freie Universität was linked to a broadening idea of for access for a society. So and it was based on a very, very strong modularity. It's almost a universal idea of architecture that through the module you would expand the notion of possibility, adaptability, and availability of space. It goes, of course, further that this idea of universal was expressed by the early buildings through a kind of a stringent module that has been executed over the entire area. It was a profoundly anti-central premise for the education. So every building had its own faculty, and every faculty basically worked with the same modular condition of grid. And this is the context which we have been asked, or we have been designing a new building. And you see, even at the early expressions, the layering, the idea of infrastructure that was related, which almost goes back to certain referential projects of a heroic modern age, like Rush City and others. And this was the current or the found condition that we have been working in. So, and this was the project on the urban level. So it was an implementation. And what they asked in their brief was an explicit central milestone, like an iconic building, so to speak, that would create in the centerless master plan a center. So and it just shows you how quickly an ideological, a political ambition basically has changed its directions and focus. And the idea that the master plan today, with a fairly generic, gridded, modular architecture, had to be encountered by a specific building for only meeting. So in other words, you could say it was almost an implementation of the Avery that I've mentioned into a kind of a context of universal gridded equality. So our idea basically was to stack this program and to create really a 60-meter high-rise building that would allow a maximum freedom in the sense of this programmatic idea of meeting, gathering, producing basically a spatial arrangements to organize a centralized meeting functions on the entire area. This was the perspective from the frontal. So the building basically only has 4 typological different levels, although it's almost 60 meters. And the architecture is really linking to this network of high lanes, this level, this bridged level over the effective ground where the students and where the network, so to speak, is taking place here in Bremen. And the concept was basically to take a indispensable expression of architecture that is very much linked to the infrastructure, to the core design, so to speak, and create a extreme robust expression of architecture. So almost a kind of analogy to the Centre Pompidou, where a maximum of freedom was exposed to core space frame and infrastructural elements that would in any case have to retain or remain as a fixed architectural expression. So, of course, with the structural engineer, we elaborated this scheme, and let's say the architectural attention is really playing into these indispensabilities of conditions that the project delivers. So, from the volumetric development to the structural development, through the organization of security, into access, the architecture developed these components that would remain an extreme high degree of freedom for the rest of the spaces. And this was an interesting scheme for us, because this is how you add the rescue route if you make a high-rise for a few thousand students that go into auditoriums, meeting rooms, seminar centers, and so on. How do you actually get these people out? And then this was a kind of an add-up of width of exit routes that were sort of the consequence of the stacking. And we translated this into an architectural agenda of exits or of staircases or of routing, so to speak, that were one of the kind of premises of the architecture. So this comes back, and the core design, the space frame design, and the kind of backbone, so to speak, became the very, very basic typological expression of this architecture, telling a transparency or a simple stacking from the front and reacting basically with the building. So the exit strategy basically became the backside of these arrangements of free spaces. And you see in section that the basic expressions were then encountered now in the planning, that all the developments of the in-builds are furnitures. Yeah, so it is like a stair, like a chair or a table, but even an auditorium is a big furniture. So everything is being developed from the idea of furnishing these premises of space that become in its expression a priority, a base expression. And you see the plans, and it reminds, of course, also typologically to some of the references that I mentioned. So exit routes, infrastructure, escalator, core system, and free space, basically, that produces an aspect of occupancy, of taking the building as a building to provoke basically social engagement or occupancy strategies for the sake of the development of education. You see the auditoriums that actually work as an inbuilt, as a furniture. The seminar level is the same thing, and the research level as well. So it's a very basic stacking and a very basic expression of architecture, allowing the expression of it. Now, the second question, which got realized, I want to conclude this input, was near Zurich. And it's also related to a meta context and a meta context of education. And in Switzerland, to go to college was always organized by a public school. I'm a kid of a public school. And then what happened actually is that the canton of Zurich, so the department that is responsible for the educational program of college, has not extended the capacity over the last 30 years, due to political reasons and budgeting, etc. But the space of metropolitan Zurich has almost doubled. So what is the consequence? The consequence is that the development of college or sending your kids into college becomes a budget question. So eminently politically questionable, so very delicate. And this project now has been designed under the premises to develop a secondary education that sort of replaces the straight access into college by a community, a wealthy community that could afford to create an alternative scenario in order to prepare their pupils for a secondary access into the college. So it sounds maybe very complicated, but it's just a political decision that has a huge impact on availability of education. And of course, the building was in a very beautiful site, and it was delicate to maintain the site, but this is not really the topic today. But I'm trying to conclude here that this project we designed had new premises, and one of the premises was that the seminar spaces or the classrooms were about to completely dissolve. And it was an incredible provocation to us, because a classroom in Switzerland was always a module, was always a kind of a given idea how to really teach and create a place, a familiar place for pupils. Now here, a complete provocation where classrooms started 18 square meter and would reach maybe even atelier sizes of 150 square meters. So fundamental different behavior. And what we did at the time is we reversed the strategy that normally the classroom is the stability concept in space and the liquidity of the space would be the circulation. We reversed that and introduced a very stiff, robust idea of circulation in order to free or in order to create a softness in space for the classrooms. And the structure of the concept, the structure of the building is designed by this circulation, which you see. So it's kind of a 3D development, a structural concept that is being created by a concept of rotation. So every core, every aisle is rotated on every level by 90 degrees, creating basically an inner structural core that would sustain large spans of the periphery of the building. So you see this structural model without slabs, so to speak. So every time the space rotates on 90 degrees. So, and the consequence of it is a building that sort of spans over 20 meters, and the aisle is sort of sustaining the potential sagging of the slab, and as a rotation or as a stacking idea, this makes basically the sense of organization of space. And this was the freeness of, let's say, the areas where were supposed to be the classrooms. And the consequences is that any kind of scenario would be able to create in terms of sizes, dissolutions. And I found that for me, this was a kind of an eye-opener regarding the question, what is really a fixed parameter in architecture to sustain education, and what becomes really liquid, almost as a sort of conclusion of the Palazzo Torconi, where this strong expression of circulation actually makes the liquid usage of the aisle of the halls in a referential use. So you see how this aisle is rotating on 90 degrees, and it kind of produces this base where almost every bay you can close or you can open, and it becomes a kind of a dissolution of what used to be the classroom. And you see that this is very much, in a way, related to a period, a temporality on one point, but also to a meta context that creates the stimulus, so that creates the constraint where architecture can interfere and solve it basically through a programmatic or also typological reaction that then makes it a formal expression of architecture. And this is the way I would like to conclude this input.
No, thank you very, very much for this lecture. The interesting thing I think about this is that these two buildings are very much related to your experience you described in the beginning, and maybe it's worth to start with a question a little bit related to this Palazzo Torconi, which you experienced in Mendrisio, and the project you did yourself. So we try to first ask questions and then hope that the audience of course is invited to ask questions afterwards. But just to start that, maybe it would be interesting to come back on this Palazzo Torconi, because what you said about this Palazzo Torconi was that it was a hospital. It used to be a hospital, and then it became an architecture school. And this is, of course, very interesting and much related to, not only the strong character of the building, but maybe also to the generic setup of the project. You mentioned also that you were studying at the ETH, which was you could say merciless generic building, where you were kind of forced to create something specific to mentally be able to survive or to escape this this tough generic character or missing character maybe of the project. What you now showed in these two projects, of course they are very, very characterful projects, I think. So the two of them are very, very strong. And how would you describe this mix of specificness and neutrality or genericness which you still have in them? So, for instance, it's interesting that the Bremen project has, of course, a bit a set of as the ZKM from OMA, this concept of floors which were very, very structural, which are like space frame structures, and that liberate the floors above. There you get really this empty floor without any column, without any disturbing element. But of course, you still have this floor which is carrying this flexible space where you have a lot of structure, the space frame zone, which is still something else than this Palazzo Torconi, which is still in its structure a completely generic structure. So it has a load-bearing facade, it has floors, and it has I guess it has a corridor in the middle where you also have columns, But how would you describe this relationship? Or maybe the other way around also, could you imagine that the project in Bremen, but maybe also the other project in Switzerland, has this same flexibility as this Palazzo Torconi? Could it also become something completely different if the architecture school is not necessary anymore?
Yeah, what I'm trying to make a point is that a very strong typology you can also translate into an experience of strategic spaces, you know, and they claim basically what becomes the heart of an activity and what can coexist or can be changed. So from a typological condition, you also shift into a strategic idea of a spatial relationship. But that I found it's a very, very interesting, because that delivers a tool to react to briefs, or that delivers for us a possibility to really express a typological spatial behavior that delivers a strategic relation of importancy and unimportancy. So, which in a way always has to coexist, you know. And the interesting thing is, of course, to what extent and what relations are these composed, you know. And so I found, for example, the premises of the 60s quite amazing, that they said there's a very anti-central behavior, you know, so that the modularity, so to design basically a module, and because you've done that, you can spread this almost into formlessness, into an endless generic condition, and you outline this strategy with the metaphor that this is related to broadening the access of a society to higher education. This was the case, you know. This was Böhm's strategy, and 60 years later, the commissioner, so to speak, orders exactly the opposite, or says, like, we need no longer, in this case, in this specific case, no longer more surface, but more meeting, more gathering. And this point, you could also relate that. So in the genericness, they ordered an aviary, you know. So that's why I also found this interesting, to come back to some of the kind of personal experiences of us in our own education, because you realize that to some extent briefs are provocations of the original paradigm, or the ideological imagination of how education should be conceived. But of course, you can now go into the building in Bremen and say, like, what is important to remain, and or is it supposed to be a university in 50 years from now? And maybe Bremen could be much more open-minded than maybe the campus most near Switzerland, which is still, in a way, based in some aspects as an educational school owned by a community, you know. So, but delivers maybe a change of what used to be not questionable or something, you know. What used to be the center point, that classes or schools run with classrooms, and for us it was the first time in Switzerland, in a very delicate political period, where a community was forced to think about like a private school, because the private schools have become the substitute of the public failure to generate access to education. So you see how these things, as architects, you see that, how they are related to political issues or political developments, or, as I said in the beginning, to ideological premises that you can, in a way, not really influence, but you can use that as a center point, or as a strategic access that would act in a similar way than a strong typological building like the Turconi, that doesn't matter what kind of program it occupies, it will always be a good building. And for me, and that's why I thought it was such a relief to see that in Medrisio, because we were trained much more into the technical universities that were believing in these premises of the 60s, in the equality of space, and in the genericness of the delivery, what you had, or the way you were dealt in space. And you come to Ticino, and you enter a building that is so carefully done, but it is much more inspiring, in the sense to deliver this hierarchy of importancy, rather than the pure genericness that no longer can really deliver differentiations on that level. So I found that an eye-opener in that sense, where you say, like, it's very hard to discuss about the political agendas that enframes us, but it's very good to talk about these emotional experiences that we can go on and give further as architects to design educational buildings.
I just asked the question also to the audience, so please don't hesitate to ask questions. Also, the people who follow us on YouTube, just type in your questions in the chat and we can just communicate it to our speakers.
Andre, am I allowed to ask a question?
You are allowed, of course.
Allowed to ask. Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. I really enjoyed that. I just have a question about vertical and horizontal space. And I think what's really interesting about both of your projects is that one is 6 stories, and I don't know how many floors the Bremen one is. But what seemed fantastic about the Bremen project as well is that you somehow avoided the tyranny of floor plates. And it's like you've stacked different worlds on top of the other, different worlds, different structures. And was this structurally driven, philosophically driven, programmatically driven, socially driven? You move from one world to the next. What made those worlds different?
It's a very sharp observation, because the worlds, so to speak, were defined in the brief. So which is normal for us, but the question was how we creating a center point in the campus. So this provocation of Böhm to spread the university was almost obliged to stack as a counter reaction. So it was more coming from the meta context, is that we could not create, although we would have the site, a new university center that would work horizontally, because we would not be really able to interfere or to counter-react the endlessness of the horizontal genericness that has been produced through this structural belief, I would say, or this gritted belief to extend this technical university. And so it was almost a paradigm to say, like, it becomes then a program to stack the different worlds on top of each other that allows us to use this vertical circulation as a circulation of experiences. That's why we wanted to have the escalator in it, because you in a much quicker way create this access vertically rather than the walking speed that we are all familiar with, the horizontal movement. But it's right. It was part of the provocation.
Mm.
Yeah, actually, I've also a question. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Yeah, I think I like very much your introduction with this. Let's say, describing the situation at the school in Zurich. I can really imagine that produced an interesting tension when designing a building. And at the beginning, you mentioned that. More or less you try, at least I understood it like that you try to, let's say, basically get a bit rid of the demands of the program by introducing a strong typologies that somehow basically can adapt the program, but also, more or less helps a bit to forget the demands of the program. And I think, let's say, what I'm interested in is first, let's say, how to choose fitting typology for a design task, how you do that. And the second thing what I recognized is that I think you did not only talk about typology, but also very often relate the aspect of typology to the, let's say, importance of structure. So I think it was very much about finding the right structural setup for the building. And what I noticed is that, or at least that was my impression, that the structure is not so much only a way to organize the building, but also the structure in itself is the main force to give character to the building. So I had the idea that that for you the expression of the buildings you design is very much related to the idea of, let's say, how the structure is defining the spatial quality. And in that way, I think it's an interesting mix between, let's say, the situation you mentioned in Zurich, that the buildings, we could say, are on one hand very flexible, but also, I think, extremely specific. And maybe you can say also something about that, if this is the right understanding.
Yes, it is the right understanding, because we of course try to be specific, because we don't want to kind of revisit our traumata of the ETH as a student, you know, where the pure genericness is not delivering, is not the solution, you know. But what I trying to say is that in educational subjects, it is interesting that architecture has to get rid of program. I mean, who of us can believe in program? I mean, anything, like even in terms of planning, you know, it's like even if you start a project before Corona and then now after or post-Corona, it's like we've already been through the 3.0 edition of the same program, you know, it's like, so everything changes anyway, you know, so as an architect, you cannot really relate to program. If it comes down to education, it's almost naive to believe in program, because it's the only thing that will change for sure. And it's not only in terms of whether it's now a university or a hairdresser, but in the sense of how you can really relate in the process of it. And the typology answer, the learning from typologies basically give us something which goes much beyond the idea of program, because strong typologies, as the Turconi as an example, was not related to program, but had a structural and an arrangement, so to speak, of spaces that were extremely important and others that were less important. So I thought, or our hypothesis in this discussion is, learning from strong typologies leads us to strategic ideas how architecture becomes important, where architecture makes its importance of points in space and where not. And you could say the structure, of course, becomes a fundamental condition to think and to occupy as an architectural topic, because it's indispensability of its indispensability. You can't get rid of it, you know. So in that sense, it's one of the basic possibilities to think about an architecture that goes beyond program. And but you could also say that by using or employing the structure, that allows you to create preferences or priorities in space, it would also deliver a tool where we as an architect could say this remains and the rest can change forever, you know. So we try to do, or let's say I'm trying to make this shift from typological learning into strategic designing architecture, and whether this then is a typology of its own is not for us to decide. It's maybe for others, but I found this is the important message.
Questioning the program, but also the idea of the room, it seems, in both projects, that you completely neglect the idea of rooms and you rather provide space. And then I find it quite a strong sentence. You said that in the Bream project, the university almost becomes furniture. And I was wondering what you think, whether this great institution can also be thought of in the scale of furniture now, whether we don't need it as a representative building in our cities, but rather as spaces with flexibility in the sense of objects?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, if you consider it furniture, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be designed. But if you put the chair now on your table or just next door, or if you just move or whatever, this is a very self-evident process of almost a daily experience. And it kind of frees to some extent the aspect of eternal expression of architecture, but it doesn't mean that it's not careless, or it doesn't mean that it's without any detail or without any sensuality being designed. But it's true, an auditorium in this idea now of our type of space is dealt in the same way as a big furniture, like a chair that is organized in the area where you have your recreation impulses. You know, so it frees you from this kind of obligation to be eternal or to be meaningful or important, but it's maybe a part of fun, or it's a part. It kind of enables other components which you can play as architects, but without the importance of that this will have to last for the next 100 years.
And let's say also would imagine that this might be also your answer to the question of sustainability, yeah? That you basically address with the building a much bigger scale than, let's say, the scale of the individual parts of the program.
Could you repeat?
For me was the question. I think this, what you said right now, is probably also, let's say, an argument for sustainability. In a way, to say we do a structure that basically makes itself independent from the program and addresses also a bigger scale than the scale of the individual room. And by doing so, you, let's say, offer a freedom that makes it possible to adapt the building to, let's say, different, let's say, uses.
Yes, I agree, but I don't know how my colleagues are dealing with this issue. But you know how we as architects are dealt with today. It's like you've been exposed to endless Excel sheets where everything is being rated what you do, and then in the end there's a figure, and then it's either being considered sustainable or not. You know, and this is a kind of the ridiculous intelligence of our current age or of our current condition to talk about this. And of course, it becomes important for us to consider things with different time spans and with different importances. And this is, of course, in a way, a tool or a strategy that can be used to address these issues as well. I mean, so it's not only about the let's say democratic measuring of everything at the same time, but maybe there are elements in your project that are only done for 2 years, and then there are other elements that work for 20 years and other for 100 years, and this becomes much more interesting. And in that sense, I think we cannot surrender the ridiculous conditions that are facing our discipline. I think we're trying to be inventive towards these criterias, or trying to be inventive out of this constraint. Because otherwise the discipline is lost, and I don't think it's lost at all. But the more constraint and the more criteria, the more it kind of almost asks for a kind of inventiveness that goes back to a kind of creative process that is the base idea of our discipline. And this is what we may be trying to encounter. That's why we are excited to design furnitures for 1,000 students, to house 1,000 students.
Does the client, the Bremen University, completely follow and support your arguments, or do you have difficulties to convince them for this project?
No, we don't have difficulties to convince them. I think what is really refreshing in this condition that you are exposed to very intelligent people. Because if you work for a university, there is an interesting committee, or in this case, I mean, it's hard to do any general statement there. But in this case, we work with a committee that are composed of very intelligent person. We experience that it's not the normal rule. You know, if you do normal housing projects or something, you're exposed to kind of very difficult committees sometimes. You know that. But here, I think this is something where we don't have to fear that our client cannot follow us. I think they're almost demanding us to be challenging and also to challenge them because they are used to do that for their own work. So I think this is maybe an advantage. But if you would have a client that would not be able to follow you, you would have to change maybe your strategies. So that's why I'm saying, like, it's not lost. It can also be the case that you have a client that is completely clueless, but they could also produce the condition to create something fantastic.
Yeah. We have another question from the YouTube audience. I will read it. The hall in Bremen, or the building in Bremen, counteracts the decentralizing of its surrounding. However, if the ground floor feels like the picture from the 60s, maybe it counters the building's strategy to create a center.
Well, I don't know, but the fact is, of course, that that's why I also show the pictures, and because the pictures have not only the history of Bremen is not only has not only a physical presence today, but also has a meta context. That's what I said. Like there was a belief how to deal with infrastructure, how to rise levels where people communicate and circulate. And I think that the project still wants to be part of this, you know. So the provocation is not that you ignoring this network that was conceived by Gottfried Böhm. I think this will be a pity. So, but we're trying to link and to connect to this idea, but create a architectural counterpoint that sort of the campus is strong enough to sustain. But that doesn't mean that we have to ignore the 60s. Why should we? You know, it's like I think we have to work with the 60s, which is much more exciting than exposing this to a condition of an aesthetic preferences, whether you like it or not. I think I have nothing to fear about that.
I think so too. Do we have more questions, or should we make the originally intended break?
It's unnecessary. We have still 3-4 minutes. Huh?
So we go on without a break?
We go on without a break, I think.
Okay. So is there more questions?
I have just an innocent comment from our, let's say, from our side, let's say, because we're always very jealous when we see these projects in Switzerland where the construction is, let's say, the main topic of the design. Because I must say, to be honest, in our world where we work, we mostly, let's say, build in the Netherlands and in Belgium and France, is that very often there's so little money that it's even impossible to, let's say, really work with big spans, because it's already far too expensive, too expensive within the given budget. And now we have also the issue that even from the sustainability side, very often we have a discussion that the big spans are, let's say, not sustainable because it costs too much steel and too much concrete and so on. And I would wonder what, let's say, your arguments would be, Pete, or if you experienced already similar discussions.
Just to add something, that was a little bit also my question about Bremen, because in Bremen the structure is a space frame, which for German public authority, I think it's quite something to build it. So if they do that, it's also quite amazing.
Yes, but it's a good point. You know, it's like let me answer this with a small episode. When in 2006, when we came to Berlin and we were competing for this Heinrich Böll Foundation, they had 7,500 square meters on the brief, and we came from Switzerland. And as Oliver said, we were a bit spoiled because the pricing and the price level in Switzerland and the manufacturing quality, in the sense of craftsmanship, of course, is very high due to a kind of, again, meta context of education, because the craftsmen are still carefully educated. But we came to Berlin and we realized that we had to design a building for 10 million euro. And in Switzerland, a building like with 7,500 square meters would have cost 50 million Swiss francs, you know. So there was a budget lack of that we thought that we would have only 20% of it. And I found that very stimulating, because it's in a way it produces the same constellation to think about how you invent a concept through constraint or through that challenge. And what was interesting, at the Böll Foundation, we introduced a kind of a bel etage, and it happened exactly once in the entire building, and there we could spend a lot of money because it occurs only once at the time. You know, it's like if you make a door that is very, very special, but you do only one of them in the project, it almost is irrelevant in terms of budget. You know, and you counter-react with a kind of a repetition of a very optimized, priced project part. And you could also say, how much percentage do you need to make an exciting building? 10%? I found strategically it's very exciting to design a building with 10% of excitement or specificity to influence 90%. And I find it very difficult to design really 90% to make a project sort of exciting. You know what I mean? It's just like it delivers the tools. Even if there's no budget, you can take much more radical position because you can tell them that there's no budget. So you have to create, you have to do your point to say what is really important, what not. It's almost inscribed in the constraint of having no money. I mean, it's just like if you have no money, you have to think about where to spend it. And I found that very, very interesting. So we concluded the building in 2008, just 2 years after the competition. It was 10 million. For me, a unique experience as a Swiss that was always thinking it was about craftsmanship and the quality of construction. No, I found it very exciting to be in the European community, to work on strategic axis of this architecture. Maybe this as a conclusion.
Thank you very much, Pete, I think.
Thank you also from my side. Very good last statement. So we could go to our next lecture, I would say. Huh? So Case Khan as our second speaker. So thank you again, Pete, and maybe you stay with us for the next.
Of course. No, I'm very curious now. I mean, of course.
Okay, so Case, could you please...
Yeah, Andre.
The way.
Here I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Well, this was a very nice lecture, Pete, and a very good discussion. I had many moments that I wanted to say something, or but it raises so many topics that are, of course, topics that we are all carrying and working with us and working on a day-by-day basis. And questions that are really interesting. So it's very tempting now to sort of try to pick up from your lecture and just completely throw away my story and pick it up from there and go into the question on generic and specific, or maybe generous. And I almost felt like at a certain moment that you were inverting generic and specific by saying the generic space becomes more fluid and the specific space becomes more anyway, I don't want to go in there, but there was one thing that you also said that is very important, I think, in the whole perception or the whole topic of the learning landscapes, which is the part where you brought up, of course, Steve Jobs and his introduction of the personal computer and the I culture, the iPhone, the iPod, the iPad, the iMac, the everything I. So with a laptop and an iPhone, we are anywhere we can have our workplace, we can have our office. And of course, that has had in the last, say, 20 years or more, a huge impact on learning landscapes and on many of our environments, and also has forced us to, I'm now going to share my screen, forced us to think better about what you also mentioned in the beginning of your lecture, the topic of identity. So let's go to this then immediately. So the topic of identity, because if we can work anywhere, then we want, but we don't want to be anywhere. We have to make everywhere somewhere. So there is a huge demand for specificity or for character, maybe, for spaces that are really interesting to be in, that are lively, that are nice spaces to find yourself and to meet people or to work together with other people. And that's why I thought, when I was preparing the lecture, basically we are trying to design immersive environments. We're trying to design environments where people with their eye bubble can immerse themselves into a certain sphere or atmosphere where they feel comfortable on one hand and can do what they want to do, but where they can engage with others and improve themselves. And say these immersive environments or immersive landscapes are the projects that we are trying to make, or that we are trying to develop. And it starts actually in my presentation with our own office, because the dream, sorry.
Case, yeah. Can you please make full screen?
Oh yeah, sorry. It starts with our own office, because the dream I always had was to have when we were in an office with pieces of floor of 200 square meter on different levels. The dream I always had was to have one plateau where everybody was on one level. I don't know why, but I always thought that would be very nice. And one day that became possible, not so far from our original place. We found a space where, in an old bank building, the bank, on the bank of the river, where we could make this, where we could create this space where we work together and where we learn together. Having a floor plate of 1,400 square meter with 5 meter free height and a column grid that is generous enough, although it's generic, but generous enough to offer us space to work together and make also more a variety of different rooms and spaces for different activities. That, like you say, you cannot program from the beginning, because you, over time, you use it in different ways. You use a space that you thought would be a mini auditorium later for doing a lot of secret competitions, or you use a meeting room for something else. You use a library for meetings. It's not about program, it's about quality of space and what we can do with it. But we like to have spaces that are sort of continuous on one hand and connected very fluidly, like you said also in your presentation, but at the same time specific and with character and identity. Well, in existing buildings, very often this is easier to achieve, maybe, because you find sometimes qualities there that already give you that. In new projects, this is sometimes more difficult, and especially if the financial issue is also at stake. One of our first learning landscapes we did was the one in Rotterdam for the Erasmus University, and I call it the excavation of a learning landscape, because when we started, we didn't intend at all at that moment. This is the beginning of 2000, just after the millennium change. We didn't intend at all to, or we were not triggered at doing this kind of a space. It was simply because we found something that we thought, yeah, this is an enormous opportunity to create this learning landscape. It's the Erasmus Education Center in the middle of the Erasmus Medical Hospital, which is an academic hospital with, I think they have 20,000 employees, and it's a university and a medical hospital combined. And at the same time, when we were starting our project, the hospital was preparing also their new construction of the hospital itself. So they were building like 200,000 square meters of new hospital, and we were doing an education center of 20,000 square meters. And the client said, yeah, the budget of your project is less than the extra work we have on the hospital. So don't worry too much about the money, just make something nice for me. We were in the slipstream of this mega project. And of course, there was a tender, there was a competition. And we were looking at the project, and we found that in this huge complex, the exact say position where they wanted this education center to be situated was, I hope you see my cursor, was in this area. And this drawing that you see here on the screen is a drawing from the original project when it was built in the 1960s. And what you can see is that it's basically a big plateau. And on top of that, different pavilions, all with a very generic structure, like typically 60s indeed, but with a sort of structural overcapacity. And the idea was that people that use this facility would walk from one pavilion to the other, over the platform outside, and enter again inside. Well, 3 months after the opening of this facility, here you see it, the floors. So those were all these entrances. And on top of it, the floors were connected. So on the third level, the second floor of this whole thing, these floors were connected. What happened in reality, that was after 3 months the building was in use, they closed all the doors here that led to the outside. And they started communicating over the third floor, over this, the second floor then. And what also happened that over time, the connection with other buildings that were built around it were made on that floor. So the building was actually from its beginning used in a completely different way than it was conceived by the architects. And people were sort of using the corridors of normal office spaces as the main circulation space in the project. And here in section of the complex, you see what this meant. So the circulation space was here on this level, where the main circulation space was supposed to be on the level +2. What we did when our client asked us to think about this project, and they asked also some other architects, we proposed to cover the inner courtyard of the building, and by doing that, restore the original intention of the complex and bring the main circulation space back to the level +2, which fitted better in the overall layout of the hospital. So our proposal was cover it with a roof. You create a big space, which at that time we thought, we had a hunch, it could be very useful for learning, because the first mobile phones were there and the first, say, Wi-Fi systems were installed, and people were starting to develop this attitude of working anywhere. You see in the picture right in the low corner, you see the courtyard. That was the starting point of this project. And the aerial picture also shows it. So we proposed this to the client, and they liked the idea very much. This was one of the sketches. They said, okay, let's do it, but that means we need to rewrite our entire program, because they hadn't anticipated this move or this complete change in the project. So they said, okay, you get the project, but you have to study now with us first on what we do with this big space. How can we use it? What do we need there? And how can it replace classrooms and other spaces that we originally had programmed in our other program? So we worked more than a year on rewriting the program, and then we got started on the project. And the sort of what we call bijvangst, if you fish, you also catch fish that you don't intend to catch, was that by taking out the corridors and the wings of this that you have here and here, because the circulation space was moved around the big space, of course, we automatically were able to create larger classrooms in the say the 60s wings that were originally intended for smaller spaces. So it was sort of a win-win situation in that sense. And the project, was a surprise. It was actually a sort of act of serendipity, you could say, that we found something that we or the client certainly not, but we intentionally not from the beginning were looking for. But we found it and we developed it further, of course. Then architecturally, the decision was made to merge the existing with the new, so not to make a contradiction or a contrast between what was already there and what was new. So what was there from the 60s and what was new in the beginning of this century, but simply merge it and blur the difference. And to make the roof not like a lightweight, greenhouse roof, but to really give it mass, give it weight, so that it sort of creates a room under it and not a covered open space. So not the feeling of a former outside space, but a room in the building, a new heart in the building. So these are the images. The question was also what to do with the library, and we symbolically made one big cupboard for it, one big cast, because the medical books in this medical university are not books like books for architects with beautiful images, etc., but they're more like encyclopedias, and actually most of it was already available online or would become soon available online. So the library became almost like a decoration, accessible still, but a decoration for the study space to give it its sort of clear feel to it. Now that's what this project sort of made, and it made this new heart in this huge academic complex. And from its start, it started functioning as that, and it became also the sort of symbol for this entire hospital, actually. Although it was never the intention of the client to become such an important element. Actually, the entire COVID crisis in the Netherlands was coordinated from this space. So it was a lot on television in the last 2 years. Another project I want to bring to this afternoon of discussion and reflection is a project on, say, vocational education that we did in Lille, where we built a chambre métier, which is basically a chamber of commerce. But in France, it's always mixed with also educational facilities for crafts. As you know, or maybe don't know, craft is still a very important or regarded as very important in France, especially making food and baking food, baking bread, but also other crafts. And this building is a sort of combination of a program for, say, companies, small companies, but also an education center for the crafts. Symbolically, the organization moved from the center of Lille to the periphery, on the red dot that you see in this image. Also sort of emphasizing its importance as a regional facility. So not just a facility for the city of Lille, but the facility for the metropolitan area of Lille. And this triggered us in the competition to propose a compact but very large scale object to symbolize this sort of position in the you could say fringe belt of Lille, the fringe belt in between, say, the villages around the city that were gradually sort of absorbed by the metropolitan Lille, and the scale that you find there, and the contrast with the density of the city. And we used the sort of territorial stratification at that point, so bridges that cross the motorway that are on a level higher than the ground floor, to create a second ground floor level, you could say, and develop the two phases of the building, so the double character, a character as an educational institute on one hand and a representational on the other hand, with two different levels in the building. And that sort of works like you see here in this diagram on the right side. So towards the city of Lille, there is this connection on the first floor from the viaduct, and to the square in the village that is on the other side of the periphery. The building has an address on the ground floor. And these two levels are inside the building connected with the big auditorium that serves both for the educational program and as it serves for the representational. So it's used by the Chambre de Commerce, but it's also used by the school. And that was sort of the vertical stratification of the project, and the horizontal one, we subdivided the entire building in 4 quarters, and each quarter also contains on each level a certain part of the program. So ground floor of the building is partly logistics and partly the entrance and facilities of the Chambre de Commerce. The top floor is the offices, so office spaces of both Chambre de Commerce on one hand and the facilities and offices for the school on the other. And the middle part are mainly, say, education spaces on one hand and representational spaces on the other hand for the Chambre de Commerce. So this way, the building sort of, which is of course big, it gets subdivided in 3 layers and 4 quarters, and that is then articulated inside with patios and cores, of course, staircases and elevators, in such a way that they facilitate this subdivision for this huge plateau, you could say, of 80 by 80 meters to function and absorb the program. And like also already said by Piet, don't follow the program because it changes while you are designing and certainly afterwards. And of course that happened also in this building. This is the level of the entrance of the educational program, so the school. And on the other side you find the entrance of the Chambre de Commerce on the ground floor. So this is the subdivision in administrational and educational in plan. In plan also the repartition of the program, the division of the program. Of course, vocational spaces, a huge professional kitchen with many desks for French new chefs of the future, but also on the other side of the building, the more representational conference and meeting spaces of the Chambre de Commerce. And in this section, it sort of worked like this. You have this stratification of 3 floors, a central space and an auditorium that connect everything. And that works like this in the overall section. Floor plans, you see here the ground floor plan with the 2 main patios on left and right side that are adjacent to the big central space that gives you a perception of the scale of the entire building and then make you understand the project. And then there are 4 smaller patios here that are bringing light, of course, to the spaces on the different floors, but also are flanking the cores with elevators and staircases. So each patio has next to it a core with elevator staircases to help you with your orientation, of course. So some images of the big patios and how the middle floor is perceived from the project towards the surrounding, and the layout of the top floor, where the building sort of gradually gets subdivided in 4 smaller buildings with each their own typical office program in it. So this project not so much was dominated by ideas about the, say, learning landscape in the sense of how can the students of the hotel school or the cooking school meet, etc., with each other, but rather how do we deal with different uses in one complex that have completely different agendas, but have to use the same space, have to co-live and co-use this large complex. And how can we create synergies between them and give them spaces that otherwise would not exist in the building if the programs would not have been combined in this way, like this big central space that you find here in the heart of the building. That gives you the view into the auditorium, and then on the top of the auditorium with the foyer at the back, that is at the level of the entrance of the educational center. So here the different sort of parts of the original program together generated sort of extra spaces that were not foreseen in the original plan. I'm going to simply, this is all very nice, the facade and how it was done. Of course, it needed to be sort of crisp and clear, accentuating the volumes. And, well, I'm not going to go too deep into it. I move on to the next one, which is the research and meet. And André asked me at the beginning today, yeah, you're going to show ISMO, I hope. And yes, here it is, André. It is an interesting project because it was the first competition in the Saclay campus development, which is a huge new, you could say, super campus southwest of Paris. In this case, our project is situated actually on the edge of the valley that is adjacent to the huge campus area. So in this aerial photo that you see on the left, you look from the north facade back to the valley of Orsay, where you find the old village and the old university. So you're standing with your back to the new development of the huge campus of Saclay. Our project was actually situated still amongst a few buildings of the original university campus of the 1960s there, and had to be sort of squeezed in between these existing buildings. So what we were doing in the competition is we were thinking, how is our building going to be part of this new campus on one hand? How do we set it into that existing context of the 60s? And how do we deal with this orientation and the program? Because it's a research building, and research buildings tend to be very introverted. Laboratories tend to be closed, and especially this kind of laboratory where they do molecular research with laser beams and light, tend to be inward orientated buildings. So how can this building participate in the new campus, in the new idea of learning landscape? And basically our conclusion was that we had to build it as compact as possible to leave as much space in between existing buildings and also for the existing trees. So that was a relatively simple conclusion that we quickly made after some study on the massing, the volumetry of the building. Then the relation between, say, research program, focus program, and communication program led us to the conclusion that we had to turn the building inside out. So instead of doing the building with corridors in the middle of the wings, we put all the corridors, all the communication spaces, you could say, of the building on the facade. And that was actually the main intervention. So corridors on the facade, spaces where reports and individual research are done, focused on around patios, and all the laboratories stacked on the north wing with different floor heights and an orientation to the north. And a small sort of void in the middle of the building above the entrance, allowing, say, the actual communication that people do when they walk from their laboratory to their office and back, allowing them to meet other people in spaces that are not hidden inside the building, but that are actually part of the campus. And also hoping in such a way to encourage the use of these communication spaces, of these corridors, to hang around, to sit, and to not hide yourself too much inside the building, but really go on a walk, go to another place in the building, meet somebody, have a coffee, engage with others. It's something that we learned recently from the pandemic that is very important. One of the main, you could say, main problems we had also in Delft, in our university, but also in our office, was not the efficiency of having online meetings and online gatherings that work very well, but simply the occasional serendipity that you have by meeting somebody incidentally or coinciding events that take place that bring you on another level of thinking, that is completely lacking in, say, a world where we all isolate ourselves in our own house or in our own room. And it's exactly this what we try to encourage in our learning landscapes, you could say. So our buildings, our types of buildings, are all aimed at developing this kind of possibilities, although maybe not always the means are there to do it. In the case of ISMO, in the case of this project, I think it's a very compact and efficient building with a very quite a good Brutto-Netto ratio. So according to European standards and budgets for education buildings, it was not an exceptionally expensive building. But inverting it completely still creates it, or makes it a building that sort of encourages this meeting. So coming up from the staircase in the parking garage into the central space, where all the corridors sort of come together, and where you find small libraries and small places where you can sit and meet, talk, gather. An auditorium that is suspended in the heart above the under the ceiling of this central void, and then the section with the laboratories on the north side that sort of show the core activity of this research building, which is doing research on molecular structure of materials. Showcases that towards the campus. So this is the project, and you could say there are some jokes in the Netherlands always when we talked about restoring monuments in the city center of Amsterdam, that you were never allowed to see the lady in red walking from one parcel to the other, because that was completely contradictory to the structure of the city. In this case, we want to see the lady in yellow walking, of course, the corridors of the building, actually walking behind the facade, but on the perimeter of the building and also in the campus. For a couple of years, I was sort of supervisor of developments in our university in Delft, following projects, selecting architects, helping the client decide on quality issues regarding the urban development of the campus and the development of the architectural projects. We, with our building, Bouwkunde building that burned down in the beginning of the 2000s, we were very lucky actually that our rigorous design by Broek en Makema building, fantastically designed building, burned down, because it's sort of in a way freed us from this dominant structure that was built up of cabinets for professors and teachers and a few larger drafting rooms for students. The first months after the fire, we were in tents, and we were rediscovering entirely our faculty and our colleagues. We all were given a laptop from the university and an iPhone, and we started working in completely different ways, working together, working in teams, and it changed Bouwkunde in Delft completely. When we got the temporary building that we are still in now, we continued that sort of way of working, and it also had an effect on our education and the way we do that, the way we organize it. I'm in my studios emphasizing teamwork, so we always work in teams, and we match individual work of individual students with also collaborative work on projects. So always big models for big scale projects done by, say, a group of 9 students on which their individual projects are also part. This collaboration or this idea or this notion was also the notion of the living campus in TU Delft, where the university had discovered that they couldn't control the development of the campus anymore, because any time in the history they thought, now we have a stable situation, something unexpected happened. A faculty disappeared completely because there was no need for it anymore, or it shrank completely. A faculty all of a sudden needed completely new research facilities that costed millions of euros for nano research or any other high-tech research that was not possible to build or facilitate in the campus, that had to be built in an area where there were no vibrations or other physical conditions, or a building that burned down and all of a sudden unbalanced the campus. So we investigated the notion of the living campus, assuming that permanent change is what a campus is about, or a university is about. Simply accepting that, and also understanding that students more and more might not stay all day in one faculty building, but are using the entire campus or parts of the campus, maybe a certain cluster in the campus. And they are not only using classrooms and college rooms, but they also need spaces where they can work together or alone. They don't stay in their rooms anymore, like maybe we did when we were students. They come to the campus to work. My kids are also doing that when they were studying. They go to the campus with their laptop and they work on the campus. When I was a student, I stayed in my room. I worked a lot in my room, and I only went to the university, like Piet said, to meet other people, but not to do my production work there. That is different today. So our campus has a completely different kind of need from the users. TU Delft was trying to make an inventory of this, map this, use more, say, data collection to really monitor the use of the campus and monitor how buildings are used, and it's still in the middle of that. Also because there is a need to figure out what to keep, what to change, and what to demolish. But one thing it knows, and it's discovered, and also other universities discover that, is that there is a new kind of campus, there is a new kind of faculty, but also there is a new kind of building need. For instance, the education building, which is not a building that is dedicated to one, say, sector of knowledge, that is a faculty, but that is dedicated to multiple sectors of knowledge, and that is seen more as a general facility, almost like a library or like a representational building, where students can go to work, but also where they can follow classes or do exams. And we developed, or we designed one of those facilities in the University of Tilburg. But in Delft, we're also building then. UN Studio is building education building there, which is still from the time when I was supervising the development of the campus and choosing or talking with the board of the university on where to build these facilities. Our project in Tilburg, the Cube, it's called, is an education building. It's a very simple building. The program, which is, of course, a program which is always a fixation of a moment. It's always an idea that what the client thinks they need to be built as soon as possible. And that's what they called the program. It's what they need. And what gets an urgency, which triggers an initiative and triggers a design and build process. And while that design and build process takes place, it takes often many years. A quick project is 4 years, and average is 8, and some take 20 years. The program is a sort of starting point. It's a critical starting point that generates the urgency, or that illustrates the urgency and allows a project to start, but then the project sort of has to deliberate itself from that program and also be able to facilitate other kinds of use, be generous and be thought carefully towards the future. In this case, this education building, we made it a very simple structure. We said, okay, if there are huge rooms that don't require daylight, exam rooms and auditoria, or not direct daylight necessarily, they could be situated in the heart of the building. They are column free, they have big spans, they can be huge spaces. On the perimeter of the building, there could be classrooms that can have different size, that need to be generous, that need to abundant daylight, a view to the campus, maybe be so transparent that the light penetrates to the core of the building, emphasized also by 2 patios that are there. And in this case, we simply cut away the corners because of the, say, more difficult corner situation of these classroom spaces. And that generated then the floor plan that you see there on the right bottom. So what you see is a perimeter with classrooms of different sizes, 2 patios, a big central self-study area that is flanked by these 2 patios, and then a big auditorium that is sunken in the ground, and that allows a transparency from the campus, looking through this auditorium to this central space in the heart. So the chairs that you see here, they are sunken in the ground. You don't see them when you're standing on the campus. You can see that in this section. On top of it, you find these exam rooms in the heart of the building, and then something very important that was also explained in the lecture by Piet. Our education buildings are not only consisting of, say, what you call a generic part, where we can subdivide classrooms and seminar rooms, and maybe the large spaces where we gather. But in university buildings, flow space is very important. This building, this education building, every 2 hours, I think, or every hour, I'm not sure, there's a bell ringing, because the whole university functions on a certain rhythm of this bell, and students move from one space to another, either an exam finishes or a classroom finishes, and then you hear a sort of increasing noise in the building, like a herd of elephants is arriving. And it takes a couple of minutes, and then it gradually sort of becomes quiet again. And in that period of 5 to 10 minutes, students have, of course, taken other places in the room, or they left the building, or new students come in. So this kind of buildings are the flow space, the staircases, the voids, the communication spaces in the building. They are a very important entity of the entire system. And our emphasis when we design these projects should be really on them. So that's why in this project, we have a lot of transparency to the green of the campus, also from these staircases and communication spaces, not just for say the nicety, but also in terms of functionality, it's very important to be able to orientate, to quickly be able to move from one space to the other and quickly find where you need to be. And it sort of increases the effectiveness of the buildings. Maybe I'm rushing a bit because I maybe wanted to show too many different things or to talk about too many different topics. I want to end it with We Live, We Learn project, this Utopia project that we made in Aalst, in Belgium, which is actually not an education building, but it is an education building because it houses the performing arts school of the municipality. So children learn to play the violin, or they learn to dance, or learn to play piano. But it's also housing the library of the city, and a small cafe, and there is a small auditorium in it. So it's a very say mixed program of you could say cultural program for the city of Aalst, and that's why on the opening day there was so much interest from the inhabitants of Aalst to come to this building and see what was made and how this would work. This is actually echt, I don't think this would happen in the Netherlands, to be honest. But this is Vlaanderen. The people were really echt super curious to see what the project was going to offer to them. This was amazing. It was also a competition. So this was also on that first open day, the central space, the library. It was a competition to develop, next to an existing building in the city center, develop this program. The circle gives you the site. It was, of course, originally on the perimeter of the medieval center of Aalst, but it gradually, as the city developed through the centuries, became a more central position. And as you can see in this drawing, is that, of course, Aalst has this typical large-scale building block structure that many small cities in Belgium are characterized by. So on one field you find different buildings that together sort of create a parameter, but it's not always very clear and precise, with a big variety of program and large enclosed îlot in the center of it. So was our site. So it was a small parameter building there. And we proposed something very counterintuitive when we did the project. And it took us a long time to figure out that we had to do that. So we proposed to make not the parameter building, but a very compact proposition for the project that would create these by doing that, would create these small public spaces around it that seem to be sort of a leftovers, but that are actually very nice, in sort of almost interior spaces that have the scale of the city center of Aalst. So with a contemporary building, which the grain of contemporary building is of course quite big compared to that of older buildings, we were able to bring back the grain of the medieval city, you could say, the scale of it. So this is what was existing. Red is what we were supposed to demolish. Black is what had to stay. And we simply said, okay, we just add a rectangular building to create very interesting and properly scaled public space around it, with each face of the building towards it and an orientation of the program towards that public space. And we frame these programs in big windows, so they interact in a very direct way with that collective space around it, so connecting the city with the program in the building. It is a building that is very much about a building for the city, for the people that live there, for the community, and that was stretched in this project in this way, in a very simple, direct way, you could say. So a new compact volume that facilitates the entire program, that sort of merges with the existing structure. So we don't put it next to it, but we sort of simply let it penetrate the existing structure in a very prominent way, creating maybe some difficult tension with it, but at the same time creating also a very nice interior void. And in that void, of course, you find the library. Then it was very difficult to combine, say, the silence of a library with music making spaces, drums, piano, violins, etc. So we situated all the music rooms in the existing building, where we had to do anyway a sort of box-in-box structure, because to renovate the old, we had to build new in it. So we might as well do that in a sort of noise isolating way. And that sort of delivered then the distribution of program over the building. So you have this entrance here on this little square with a cafe right next to it, an entrance to a small auditorium, the library. All the structure of the building here in this space is hidden in the bookcases. So there is no structure there. It's one big space with bookcases in it, and they sort of camouflage the concrete slabs that carry the roof, and also that carry the staircases and the floors in the middle. And that's the result of the project. Here again, the drawings that sort of give you this idea. So everywhere where you see bookshelves, you can imagine that you find there a load-bearing structure that carries the floors and the staircases and the roof of this, say, one space building. The library is the core, and then around it, the different other usage. And of course, the views towards the city. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Kees, for the lecture, and I would like to start with the first question. Basically, you started the lecture with a sort of Los Angeles-like argument to say, okay, when you have an office, why should not be everybody on one level? Mm-hmm. And I think by doing so, you addressed on one hand, I think the problem of stacking. That's always difficult to make an education building with a lot of floors. But basically, you also said that the horizontality is a way to offer probably more or better spaces for the informal learning in a way. What is more or less, I would say, a new thing to give an answer to informal learning and to also get rid of the program, or more or less to have an influence on the program. And I have a, let's say, very precise question to Kees. Do you think that the architect should also be an advisor for the space program, or do you try to generate a situation that you become an advisor for the program, or an advisor for educational buildings? Because as I understood, at least in several projects, you mentioned that you were really going for an open process and try to also use the program as a starting point, but at the same time to free yourself from the program.
Well, yes, I think that architects are, of course, or should be engaged in the discussion and the debate on how our education buildings, or actually all our buildings, can be given a starting program, or how they could be, say, how the question could be asked to the architects community on how to design them. The question, the word program could be a little bit confusing because we interpret it maybe in different ways. I said in my presentation that, well, I always tell my students, or I try to explain them, that by nature we always design for the wrong program, because we need it, because our clients need to agree that they are willing and prepared to invest money, or to get investors to invest money to build something, because there is a certain need for something. And the proof that they need it is very often that they can say, we need so much program. We need this kind of square meters to use in that kind of way, in such a way, blah, blah, blah. And that costs so much money. And that's how they start writing a program, or output specifications, they call it nowadays, with requirements. Technical and spatial requirements, and it goes very far and becomes very specific. And when we do competitions, sometimes we are able to discuss those specifications and requirements, and sometimes not at all. My experience is in Germany, not at all, because you're immediately out if you don't obey the level playing field. So you cannot win any competition if you question the program or the requirements, or it's very difficult. In the Netherlands, sometimes it's possible. You sometimes get in a situation where you sort of, like in the Erasmus, where we said, why don't you do this? And that they said, yeah, why don't we do that? It could be possible, but that is exceptional. I'm not saying that that is a normal situation. It is rather exceptional. My experience is that also in Belgium, there is a bit more flexibility in interpretation when you do a competition. And in France, actually as well. I think as architects, yes, it is important to engage with this question. And I like very much your topic of today, and I also like contribution of Pete, where he said, yeah, he puts on the agenda this question of the endless generic horizontality versus the stacking, and finally saying, yeah, what we need to design is the structure, because that is what's going to stay forever, and the rest is all interior and can be adapted. I agree totally with him, but still what we do a lot nowadays is try to make facades load bearing, because then you're also rid of your structure for a large part. Also, that stands in the way of certain types of facades, of course, but I hate columns in my buildings, to be honest. I always try to hide them or not have them at all. But there's still also the question on, say, the size of floor plates and the endless horizontality versus the verticality and the spatial qualities of it that are allowed when you have verticality. So is a floor plate of 500 square meters big enough for a certain interaction between people? Do we need 1,000 square meters or 2,000 square meters? I think this is something that has to always be very carefully questioned when we work on projects, if possible, of course, because sometimes a site is given and we have to work with it. But I would say for working and learning landscapes, smaller floor plates that are like 200 square meters, 300, I would say they are really not preferred. That's something we know by now. I think it starts somewhere around 800 and more. And it sounds a bit banal, this, to say that, and it sounds a bit arbitrary, but I think that based on a lot of comparison, it's something you could say, but maybe you can also, with your students, figure that out, because you said you studied like 100 or 200 buildings by now. So maybe you can find these very banal parameters of, say, how big actually needs a floor plate to be, or how big needs a proper education building to be. What is a nice size of it without the beautiful spatial sort of extras it can have, you could say. So when does it start to work? We know that on 1,000 square meter, you can work very well with about 50 to 70 people. Maybe when it becomes 100, it becomes a bit tight already. And then I mean gross square meters, so it includes all the facilities, this also the cores and the staircases and the flow spaces, etc. So it's gross square meters. So I think this is a very important question, because if we say that the specific program is no longer the reliable source to use as an argument to design our buildings, we need to find other anchors to make our decisions and choices, and also to bring our clients along, to get commitment from our stakeholders to make the projects. Because that question was also raised to Piet. How do you convince your stakeholders of your exceptional concept? And of course, we also have to do that in our projects.
Yeah, you said also in your lecture at a certain moment something like it had to be as compact as possible. And let's say we also noticed that, let's say, I think at the moment, let's say one very new quality of education buildings is that they are far more compact than the buildings we know from the past. So for sure there is this know-how from the, let's say, 19th century building or modernist buildings, but what we noticed that, let's say, for certain reasons, that has to do also with sustainability, that has to do with budget, but also with the aspect of these informal learning and the fact that you have to bring people together in a building, that the buildings itself become fatter and fatter. You get, let's say, very big, and you also mentioned it with the 80 by 80. I mean, the building what you did in Lille. I mean, it was, I think, unthinkable in the 1950s or 1930s. But nowadays you see that more often, because we think that I have the idea that that is a sort of direction that answers new demands within society. I don't know what's your opinion about that.
I agree totally. That's something when I talk about floor plates and then square meters, I almost implicitly assume that everybody understands that doesn't mean buildings that are 12 meters thick and then 100 meters long, because then you have 1,200 square meters, but that's really like, that wouldn't work. So floor plates also, bigger floor plates also implies fatter buildings. But that also then implies more possibilities for structural invention, innovation, more possibilities for spatial relations, maybe higher floor to floor heights. So it also implies new possibilities in that sense. You have relatively less facade and more compactness in your building, and you have potentially more variation of spatial quality.
Okay, I would like to ask the audience if there are more questions.
So, since you are working in different countries, I'm wondering if there's something like a social idea of education or social identity that also influences the process of designing educational buildings. Because get rid of any like specific or program that stays forever, and more like building a building that is more like a shell that you can fill sounds like a universal strategy that you can apply to countries all over the world or Europe. But is there something specific in the culture moment of societies that influences you while designing buildings?
Yeah, this is more a general question, I think. I like this question, by the way, very much, because I'm aware of and we see it already this afternoon, and also in the lecture of Peter came, the Swiss way, and the budgets, and when you work in Germany, etc. Yes, if I'm living in Rotterdam. If I go in the car, and I know that Andre and Oliver know this as well, and you drive 100 kilometers to the south, there's another world with another culture, with completely different values and completely different ways of doing things. That's Belgium then, in this case, where also the process of initiating, designing, and building buildings is done differently than in the Netherlands, and certainly differently than in Germany. So this does not only count for, say, the educational aspects. Maybe they are more universal, you could almost say. So maybe what students want and what universities want and need is less different in the different countries than the way we organize our way of getting those projects done, and the way that is embedded in our culture. So there we have a huge complexity in Europe. I mean, there are still, every country still has its own building regulations, its own legal regulations to organize the relation client-architect, its own standard contracts with the contractors, mandates and responsibilities for different stakeholders and participants in the process, political differences that are huge in terms of what the common sense is, or the common values are. So this is a very rich landscape of differences that we are operating in as architects. And I like it very much, to be honest, that there is this huge differentiation. But it is also a bit confusing because, like in projects like you are venturing now, this research on learning landscapes, might assume that there are universal values to be found, and I'm sure there are. But they always have to be, they always have to engage this local diversities that will stay for long, I think.
That's a very, very interesting point, I think. But that leads a bit to a question that I had. In all your projects, there's a very, very strong typological backbone. So you very often choose this typology of building where you in the center have either a courtyard or a special space, an auditorium, and then you have more generic spaces that are organized around that. So there's a very, let's say, rigid typological core of the project. Very often, especially in the projects you did in the Netherlands, you have a very, very also rationalist approach for the appearance of the buildings on the outside. So the building expresses one-to-one on the outside this nature of it, this rigid order inside in a facade like that. So in that sense, it's kind of related also to general ideas of Mies van der Rohe, I would say, for instance. But then sometimes in your projects you choose some exceptional elements. Then you kind of introduce a kind of you could nearly say original element or very specific element, which is like not at all in this nature, or slightly trying to escape this nature of rational setup of the project. And maybe the strongest was in this project in Aalst in Belgium. And my question was, where does this element come from? Is it related to what you just described in the last answer, namely that you kind of react on a certain context, or how does it come? Huh? Or maybe the question posed in another way: how do you see this relationship between the super specific and the neutral? What's your idea on that?
Yeah, I think I understand the question, and this is actually this is a core question that we are working with and searching at, in our own work. When we do our introspection, we talk sometimes about portraits and characters when we talk about our buildings, because they're all family, but they're all very different. I think that when you use the word rigid, when you say your typology that you choose, or that you have your concept that you define, but I would say, rather than using the word rigid, I would say outspoken. Because that allows us to not be rigid anymore. But outspoken is absolutely true. I think it comes from the dilemma that we are working with, that we have to define very clear ideas for projects, very strong, clear ideas in our Dutch culture, but allow for the conversation to start, the dialogue to start with different stakeholders, with society. We have to allow a certain process of consensus to be reached. So, and we know that our projects very often take a long time to we have to carry them a long time with us, not only in the Netherlands. Our museum in Antwerp took us 20 years. 2003 we won the competition, and it's not yet finished, almost. But that means projects are very extremely long processes with many people stepping in and out and joining the story of the project. So we base our projects all on very simple narratives. We make a story for the project, and we also know that we have our own agenda, but we don't want that to be dominant. We want the agenda of the users or the clients or the community that we work for to be merged with it, so that becomes really their project. And we are constantly trying to balance that. So balance the autonomy of our role as architect with the empathy for the community. So we don't want to develop autonomous architecture that is sort of autistic and puts it top down where it has to be. But we also not want to co-create with the community. We want to drive the vehicle and be in control, but we want to allow a certain amount of influence in the project to not, because otherwise the projects simply become boring. They become another autobiographic expression of our own hang-up. I don't like that. I don't want them to be haunted with my ideas. I want them to be transferred, you know, carried over to society where we make them for. So that is really important, I think, in the work we do. I don't like it if I have to repeat the story so many times during a project that I hear myself talking, you know, Groundhog Day. You live the same day over and over and over again for years. So that's boring. And the project has to become also the project of the people that are going to use it and that are initiating it, but without losing the important role that we have as architects. It's almost like bringing up children, you know, it's parenting. Yeah, it sounds a bit pathetic maybe, but it's what it is.
Thank you very much, Kees. I think it was a good end of of the comment section. And I would like to give now the floor to Shelly Mcnamara.
Can I say that Yvonne wasn't with us at the beginning of the lecture, but Yvonne has been able to join us now, so we're both making this presentation.
Wow.
So Yvonne, do you want to start?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And if I can share the screen, I'll begin if somebody gives me the brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to share and take, just bear with me. Thank you. And I go into slideshow and begin. Excuse me now, a slideshow and from the beginning. I'll just reduce this. Okay. So first of all, hello everybody, and it's a pleasure to be involved with today. I'm sorry I couldn't attend earlier on, but I imagine it's a wonderful topic, and I think the learning landscapes is a brilliant combination of words, and it's also because many of us are involved in both practicing architects and teaching. So I would like to begin the structure that Shelly and I will use today is that I will talk. It'll be in two parts. I'll talk for half our time, and Shelly will talk for the other half of our time. And I'd like to in terms of learning landscape, I'd like to really focus on the power of the section and its ability to find overlap. And these two little drawings are the DNA of two particular projects. The pencil captures an invented container of two universities that I will speak about. One is UTEC, the university in Lima in Peru, and the other is the Anthony Timberland Center for the University of Arkansas in the United States. Each has its own requirements, and each has its own ethos and ambition, and each is in a specific place on this fragile earth, and it's about use and place and invention. And we would argue that one of architects' roles is to heighten the awareness of where you are as a human being, as an individual in this precious globe, and that the choreography of spaces obviously needs to be fully experienced to be architecture, but so reading plans and sections, it doesn't actually convey the complexity of volumes, and that the impact of changing light throughout the day and the human interaction of space is something to be experienced. And one of the things that's really, I suppose, important in our COVID time is that you could say that buildings are lonely for people. And it also questions, in terms of learning landscapes, how we fared without university buildings and what we have missed. So the pandemic has allowed us to stand back and to also see what it actually means to be in a building, and what does it's a question. What does architecture give? And why is it worth the investment? And why are you, as students of architecture, dedicating so much of your life and your resources and your intelligence and imagination to find clues about how to if you like, participate in this amazing profession of architecture. So the issues of just looking at these two buildings in different places. On the left-hand side is Lima, and on the right-hand side is the building in Arkansas. One is a concrete structure in a city in South America, and the other is in North America. So I'll begin, and these two, they're like study, if you like, practical studies for students to challenge you, I suppose, to think and to ask questions, and to ask questions of us as practicing architects. So this here is really describing, it was a competition that we did in 2011. And it was on the left-hand side is an aerial view of the desert city of Lima. It's one of the few desert cities really in the world, and it's a place with these amazing. On the right-hand side, this image here is of a huaca, which are very early civilizations who lived in this place, and they make these beautiful stepped places which still exist in Lima, which are handmade bricks to form these ritual gathering places, these kind of platforms. So this is a desert place, 12 degrees down from the equator. It should be really, really hot. It is on the ocean. It has these 40-meter high cliffs in from the Pacific, and because of a von Humboldt current coming up from Antarctica, instead of it being a really hot city, it's actually kept very cool by this current, and sometimes you have this amazing fog. So we began, I mean, when you ask about, learning landscapes, this was for a brand new university. The university had technical schools to the lower levels before, and they wanted to build a university. And they had this incredibly unusual site, which is the sketch here, which was about 300 meters long on a valley in from the ocean. The sketch is describing the 40-meter high cliffs. And the requirements for the new university were for very big laboratories, smaller laboratories, classrooms, teaching spaces, and the library. And for us, this was an opportunity. This little sketch is really describing, on the right-hand side is a very busy road, and then the site was actually relating to quite a beautiful residential area. So for us, it was a matter of invention. We took the requirements of the brief, which is what architects respond to. We are not sculptors, we are architects in the profession that you as students are studying. So you take need, and it's about transformation. And what was interesting is that we thought about these cliffs, it's just interesting, as being like a hard shoulder, that we imagined that could we make a new type of cliff facing the motorway, creating cascading gardens that would face down to the area of Barranco, to the south, and that we would imagine that when El Nino, what's really interesting is that it's an aside though, but there's only about 7 to 9 millimeters of rain in this. So this is not about what was amazing is that it allowed us to ask the question: what is a university on a very tight site, on a that in a place where the climate is very different than if it was in Alaska or in colder places in the world? And could this challenge this kind of situation, that we could ask educational questions? What could a university be here? What could it be? An arena for learning? Could it be a man-made cliff? And how many of the spaces needed to be enclosed, and what could remain outside? And for us, this wonderful drawing, this Naturgemälde, which is this beautiful, beautiful drawing by von Humboldt, where he synthesizes all the various scientific data of around the world in his travels down to South America. And he does this section and this beautiful drawing, so that we are affected by place, we are affected by atmospheric pressure. And this was he was an incredible person in terms of synthesis and what we're really dealing with now as the earth, as our client. So we began with a question, And this is really challenging, I suppose, to the students. We had a new university on a very tight site, a huge amount of accommodation. What could we invent that was also had a sectional idea about overlap? And we loved these fantastic projects in South America by this is a stadium by Mendes de Rocha, and what we loved is the ability of the structure to allow social space to kind of liberate. So we used this cascading section with the roof of the bigger spaces down below to become something in terms of heritage. This beautiful image on the right hand side is the terrace, the beautiful terraced pieces of up in Machu Picchu. So we were really trying to weave in cultural elements within this new university in Peru. And this amazing photograph for us, these are two photographs of different things. On the left-hand side is Machu Picchu, the 15th century, city of the Incas in the Ande Mountains, and on the right-hand side is the Skellig Michel settlement off the coast of Ireland by the approximately 9th to 10th, 11th century monks, hermitage monks who lived in the edge of the Atlantic for our culture. Both stone buildings, both with pieces with the intimate clinging gardens to unbelievably the precipices that relate to mountains and to sea, but also the intimate spaces that we were trying to include in our university. So this is the section trying to translate an idea, an invented idea of a vertical university within the culture of a place where much could take place outside. So we wove this section, which are these bridges of circulation. We made the big laboratories on view. So if you are a student of one of the other disciplines of engineering, that you are able to visually see what is going on. So not only are you viewing into the images on the right hand side, into these laboratories, but you're also perched in a position where you are aware of where you are on the earth. So this student is studying, but also looking out to the vast city of 12 million people in Lima. And here we have an image then of the structure. So for us, it's a concrete building. It's seismic location. So this is really a way of protecting against the 12 degree from the equator sun. So this image, this peaked cap is protecting because yes, it's a benign, in the 20s degrees Celsius, but it also is a place that has, a very hot sun. So this is protecting against the sunlight, but also allows the breezes from the Pacific to enter into this space. So this void is really the heart of it. And in terms of learning landscapes, this is really bringing the air and the wind from the ocean into this place, that the landscape, the physical landscape of the roofs become the places of private outdoor space and gardens for the students. And here you see the 1.5 seismic isolators, because Lima is on a fault line, so it's also seismic. Essentially, the parking is held into the ground and the building is allowed to move. So for us, what was amazing was that this, if you like, banana-shaped or a boomerang-shaped site would have these structural circulation systems, which are every 20 meters, which allowed us to weave the requirements like an abacus between the various pieces of structure. And what for us has worked very well is by not having it straight, you get this kind of medieval sense that you're moving through the kind of forces of gravity in a slipped way. So the image on the right-hand side then sees this, if you like, the literal landscape coming in from the city, the movement and relationship out, the protection from the sun, and the visual and social and educational connection into the facades of the laboratories and teaching spaces. So here we have this building sitting in its busy motorway, which, if you like, is the new cliff edge of the building, protected from the sun. And in terms of reference, what's really interesting is when we were beginning this project, in terms of typologies, we were looking at Eduardo Soto de Moraes Braga, a municipal stadium in Portugal, which he built in 2003. And for us, it was that for asking the question, could a university be something else? Could it be an arena for learning? And in terms of choice. Could that be, could an arena be something that we could use? The second project, which I'll deal with, is in Arkansas, and Arkansas is in the United States. And what we were surprised about, that on the right hand side we were looking at Fayetteville and just looking at its climate, and we were surprised. It's up in the Ozark in the northwest of Arkansas, that it rains heavily in all of the months of the year, which is really an interesting thing for us to come to know. And then also looking at the history and the making. I have to say that it was very interesting competition, because this was specifically to deal with the training of architects in the University of Arkansas in timber, and this was to be a showcase timber building. So we looked at the history within the United States, in this part of the United States, of these wonderful Ozark barns, these kind of no-nonsense timber structures that tell you what they're doing, but also this absolutely beautiful thorn crown church, which is made by the architect Fay Jones. And what's really beautiful, it's inspired by, Saint-Chapelle, the Gothic church in Paris. But what he's done is that he's taken the elements of timber that could be carried by two men into this wood to make this beautiful church in pressure-treated southern pine. So we were looking at culture, we were looking at place, we were looking at materials, within the repertoire of timber, and these study models, this sketch is really education in terms of the landscape, educational landscape. There were rooms that were required, and one very big room, which is the fabrication shop. So these very early and kind of innocent models are really describing a kind of a search for us as architects to try and find this container where it was worth students to go to a building, was worth a university to invest in making a new building. It was worth the kind of, if you like, deep research into the capability and versatility of timber. So this little guy is showing the fabrication shop, which is the biggest room, and all the other little spaces relatively, that these were auditoria and various studios and other rooms required in the building. So these are our study models, really trying to get the measure of the, if you like, the versatile section. And also in terms of us translating from the place, the heavy rain, and that the heavy rain gutters, we invented these huge canoes to carry the water and to take it away, but also that they would play a role in the architecture, in the making of the space. So socially and educationally and landscape, we brought the learning landscape of the big fabrication room up from below into the rooms above. And the colored drawing is really us trying to come to terms with the possibilities and versatility of different types of timber, from white oak to hickory, and whether they're glulam or white oak. So that's the stage we're at the moment. So in terms of the section, that we're really bringing this big space, rather than it being, this is a type of shed, that we're taking the shed as a reference, that this no nonsense kind of shed is the place where you have one space that links to the other. And in plan, you enter on the lower level to the big fabrication shop, and all the other rooms, if you like, wrap around it. And these external views are as you enter to the side and below. And this is really describing the connection between the fabrication shop up to the teaching spaces and the control of light. We describe if you like, the roof as a canopy of light and air, that the section is an educational connector, and that in the various weathers of Arkansas that this is the case. So here the building stands on the main street, connecting part of the university with these vertical contours and expressing itself as a new interpretation of shed. So Shell?
I'm going to talk about two, maybe let's say more normal contexts for universities. The one on the left is School of Economics in Toulouse, which I will present, and the one on the right is the London School of Economics also, which I'll just refer to. But what I suppose is different to the projects that Yvonne has just shown, we're dealing with more familiar urban contexts in both of these cases, and we're dealing with the same program, you could say. We've done a number of schools of economics, and they're always different because the ethos of each university is different. Next image. So just to say that one of the questions was, do informal factors influence the design? And probably in relation to the previous speakers, whom I enjoyed very much, we're probably much more, I don't know if anyway, we're more pragmatic, I would say. I think in many ways, it's interesting to see your work in the context of other people's work. We seem to gather moments and put them together and find the construct. And what we found in this moment in Lincoln's Inn, it's the tiny little yellow building on the right-hand side and overlooking Lincoln's Inn Fields. And then there's the John Soane Museum to the north and our building, which is like a floodgate between the dense university and the park. And we took the undercroft of the Lincoln's Inn Chapel as an inspiration. And the whole idea of this university, in a way, is to lift the university up and make a free space to the city. And that's all I'm going to say about that project, really. But what we're always interested in is what is the additional thing that you can give back to the city or to the place that you're in. So I'm going to talk about Toulouse, which again is a University of Economics. We think about this as a kind of sundial because it's a very complex site. It's on the breach of a medieval wall, very picturesque, beautiful location at the junction of the old city and the new city in Toulouse. And the project that we did in Milan that was referred to in our introduction was very much about occupying the ground with the larger rooms and then offices up above and making a free space between. And this was quite a different project where Yvonne used the term choreography. This is a very beautiful city, and we lifted everything up into the air, so to speak, and the big rooms face the river, face the Garonne and the Midi Canal. And we made these openings between those big public rooms to make very large windows between the interior courtyard and the city. Next image. And I suppose this carries on from Yvonne's description of relation to place, the very particular relationship to your own place, and picking up on the quality of and the characteristics of the city. We found Toulouse extraordinarily beautiful with these big red brick buttresses and tiny courtyards with windows to the sky, and many of the buildings that we visited, you were always moving outside or in a semi-external space. And they have these wonderful cloisters, buttresses, colonnades, and we kind of made a collage of these elements. This is our competition drawing to do with how we could connect with outdoor spaces, both at ground and at roof level. Next image. So in a way, it's like a spiraling cloister starting on the lower level and ending up on the roof. What we also found was that we started with a perimeter block in terms of the way the building sits in the ground, and then it becomes free as you move right up to the top. It's like the building comes out of the ground like a butterfly, a kind of metamorphosis. So the DNA of the project keeps changing as you move from ground to sky. Next image. And each of the surfaces is modulated in terms of environmental control, in terms of views, in terms of exterior and interior spaces. There was a comment from Case that he didn't like columns. We probably love columns, but we have only one column in this building because all the facades are structural. Most of the circulation is, again, external, except when it becomes very private to the research offices. So you're moving in this tempered space between lecture rooms and between office spaces. Next image. And when I talk about the kind of spiraling of the cloister, it starts on the lower level. They have this lovely thing of making cocktail terraces between lecture rooms, which we capitalized on. And then the cloister disappears up into the fire stairs, which is also used as a day-to-day stairs, all the fire escapes to the edges, which frees the middle. And then we made the Sky Cloister, which continues this promenade in section. And what we found was really important is to bring the city into the building, to always relate the student to the bigger outside world. And that's something we're very interested in, is how the student, in the intensity of their academic, or in the case of the Arkansas building, their practical life of making, that they're conscious, partly to do with release on the big horizon and the bigger picture, so to speak. Next image. And that thing of the intimate and the more, you could say, heroic almost, which was exaggerated in Lima, that thing of needing to make intimate spaces and also to relate to the bigger world beyond. Next image. And even small cracks, we just find that these small cracks, because it's actually a very tight site, and we call it, it is a kind of sundial. Everything rotates around this central heart, which is protected from wind and rain, but is outside. And that's something that is also really important. We always try to delay that moment where the door closes behind you and you're in an interior world, that somehow you bring the world outside with you for as long as is possible. In the next image. And just looking at the language, I know we're not dealing with, less necessarily dealing with language today, but we are dealing with landscape, and from Yvonne's point, we are dealing with place and connection with place. And I suppose movement, the other two speakers have also dealt with movement, and there have been presentations which are to do with horizontal movement and vertical movement, and this is something that is really close to our hearts, is how you can move with pleasure around a university or an education building. Next image. This is something we look at regularly, the plan of St. Gall, and it's partly to do with these questions you ask about education. What is a place of education? And one of the things that we love about this plan is that it keeps drawing you into the story of the place. But it's also the fact that it has so many layers of use, from animals to monks to sacred places to places of work, and how compartmentalized our lives have become these days, and how important it is in the world of education to somehow find a way, although it's not always the role of the architect, but to find a way of not only overlap of students within their particular department, but potentially to encourage university authorities to have overlap of different departments. I mean, it used to be that philosophy was paired with medicine and with science, and architecture with engineering or whatever. And it's that kind of impoverishment of compartmentalization that's something we try to resist or change in what way we can. Next image. And in some ways, I suppose the buildings that have done this most for us in terms of the program, and there's also an interesting point made about program, that program is program the leader, or is typology the leader? And I'd just like to, something that came to my mind when I think it was Pierre who was saying this, something the Smithsons say, which is that the most adaptable buildings, I think it's in their book, Conglomerate Ordering, that the most adaptable spaces are those that are designed for very specific uses. And because they have an order and a quality, and because they're great pieces of architecture, or if they are great pieces of architecture, then they can be used for anything, which I think was the point that Piet was making about the Turconi building. But there's also something that Dalibor Vesely, the fantastic historian and theoretician from Prague, I remember he came to our Dublin University School of Architecture many years ago, and made the case that typology was a block to the imagination, and that it stopped people thinking from first principles as to what a space could be. He also talked, I think he was the first person I heard speaking about visual acoustics, that our senses prepare us to receive music, or in this case, maybe to receive knowledge, our senses prepare us or don't prepare us, as the case may be, to receive that thing we're in the building to receive. This is Kingston University, a town called the Townhouse, and it's our most recent university project. And it's also interesting in that it brings dance and library and experimental teaching spaces together. And the idea is that it's an open house for students. So it's designed, some of the universities, there was a lot that we've done, there was a lot of preoccupation with the professors. In this project, it's all to do with the well-being of the student. And we just show this image because we have the building in the context of the bigger landscape. And then what that means, us opening up the building to that landscape and taking the landscape into the project, is the moment of experience on the right-hand side. So next image, Yvonne. So what let's say the additional component in this project was to make the university feel like it has a civic presence in a very unattractive road in a not very attractive place, but which faces on the other side of this road a very beautiful public building, a county hall. So on the one hand, we were trying to make a very open, porous building, but on the other hand, we were trying to give it this civic character. And even though you might think it doesn't make climatic sense in London to turn a building inside out and make a loggia and a colonnade which wraps around the edge, we felt it was really important to make a building which felt like it was really outward looking. Next image. So we were also, and then just thinking about typology, we were also thinking one of the buildings that really inspired us was the Paulista furniture store in Copenhagen by Jørn Utzon, because the way the client was describing the program, they were talking about adaptability and overlap, and we loved this space, which really felt like a warehouse. And we also loved the sketches of Utzon, which in this case relate the idea of walking in a woodland to the structure. But what really challenged us was how we could make something that feels like a warehouse, what Yvonne calls a warehouse of ideas, that it could feel very non-prescriptive and open, and that we provide light and volume and ventilation, and that within that students could inhabit it in whatever way they wished. Next image. And just to say that one of the things that we did was we brought dance and library together instead of separating them out. We thought that it would be fantastically stimulating to always make one aware of the other. So we have the really quiet spaces in contact with the really noisy spaces, which are rehearsal studios and performance spaces. And we also made the central heart of the building into a kind of what we call a democratic space, a courtyard where events and lectures and teaching or celebrations can happen, and that this feels like the heart of the building. And on the bottom image is the wish to give the building a civic presence, and then we've planted this with vines so that it's usable by students. Which Yvonne mentioned the COVID time, this building worked extremely well during COVID because the circulation is on the exterior. And again, we did this for fire safety reasons, to somehow escape to the edges, but also make it a place of pleasure. Next image. And what's fantastic then is you get dancers in what is sometimes a lecture space, sometimes a formal space. We've opened this space up to the foyer so it can be sealed and acoustically separate, or it can be where people wash in from the street and have a look and see what's happening, and can be aware of the library spaces up above and vice versa, and that there's a real kind of vibrant heart to the project. Next image. So it's a simple concrete frame. You could say everything is precast. It's light and volume, and the manipulation of light and volume. It's quite neutral in many ways. it's acting in a sense as a kind of background to the educational vision, to try and give space and adaptability to this client who really wanted to make something really open and open to the future, because that's something that's also come up today, is what is a university now and what is it in the future. What we like about the image on the right is there's the bus stop, because this university has very long connection with the community, and the building is open to everybody. People can wander through the building from top to bottom. They can become members of the library, so it can be a public library as well as a university library. There's no security. There's a little beep that reminds you to check in a book. And there's that real sense of the idea of an open university carrying right through to the management of the building. So that's our presentation of 4 buildings. Yvonne mentioned that we really enjoyed the theme, as did the other speakers. But personally, I really enjoy also the question of typology and what the role of typology is in architecture, and how can we challenge that, whether it's turning a football arena into a university or a warehouse or whatever, or taking just mixing typologies, that maybe it's a free landscape, that a university is different things in different places, and that it's something that in all cases needs to be able to grow and change into an uncertain future. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, both of you, Shelly and Yvonne. I find it a very, very strong presentation. The projects you have done, and you probably still do it in the same way, they are all, each one, a very characterful individual thing, organism, in fact. So you try to, each time, at least that's what's kind of coming over now, try to nearly invent a kind of a structure for this specific purpose you work on. And then these projects seem to be very varied, very different. And maybe a question to start with would be, and Case Khan mentioned that maybe there's a kind of universal thing which things have in common in the end. How would you describe in your project something like this maybe universal element which all these projects have in common? Huh? So you also say typology can make people stop thinking, make people maybe too blocked or to fix on something. How would you describe then this kind of maybe common element of your project? Does that exist? Do you think about it? Is that part of your reflection? Maybe we can start with this as a question.
Okay, well, if I may begin, thank you for your question, Andre. When you talk about individual or organic or invent, and you ask then, are there certain themes that continue? I think the theme, it's really interesting, especially post-COVID or during nearly post-COVID, that why do you go to university for a start? Why do you, what does a building do? Why do you invest so much? What do you go for? So for us, I think there are many components. It's like as if we are jugglers, there is the dream of the client. What is the particular essence? Each university is very different. Each group of people working in universities, they have a very different ethos. So one is like Shelly described, the bravery, if you like, of the Kingston University to have no barriers, to allow people walk in from the street, have a cup of coffee, go up to the library, go to the top floor and not have barriers. I mean, that's extraordinary to do that. So they're one kind of client. So one is the understanding or listening. I think that in the training of architects, and you ask about, what are the universal kind of things, I think is trying to listen to what the client is trying to say or can't say or hasn't said. I think that there's listening, and then there's the sense that we are all working individually, all at home, let's say in COVID time, and you realize that when you go into a building, like say the project in Kingston, going up and down that stairs, the students are aware of each other. So I think that university, it's where you bump into a professor and ask an important question, or see a human being that you admire and you want a moment of conversation. So staircases and chance opportunities for meeting. And I think that we don't have the proper tools. I think we're doing a number of projects now. One of the things is how people move. When you put in people movement, what happens? People move within buildings. So your question about variety and what are the universal things? I think it's the sense that the relationships and movement within any building state what the ethos of this particular university is, whatever the university is, why you gather, whether you're behind, like when you think the other buildings in Kingston have corridors, they're built in the kind of 60s, corridors, doors, solid doors, rooms, you walk down a corridor, you open a door, oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong place. Oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong place. So I think that the generosity of space, that our role as architects is to make like a pestle and mortar, that when you make a university building, it's about, yes, there's research and there's quiet rooms, but that doesn't mean that you're down in a well separated. So I think the universal things would be generosity, listening, kindness to one another, visual overlap, a relationship to nature, like Shelley was describing the colonnade on the outside. Their fire, you see, I think what's interesting is that they're fire routes, and the same is true in Toulouse. But as architects, we can translate the most mediocre functional requirement into a place of pleasure. So I think that rather than students groaning under the requirements of making something safe and having fire routes, that they can become places of enjoyment. Shell, do you want to add to that?
No.
Okay.
I have another question, just following this one. Do you monitor your buildings, how they are used? Do these intentional ideas work out really well? For instance, in Lima, this is of course, it's a very, very special typology. I mean, it's amazing. I find it really an amazing project. But for instance, the fact that it's stacked so much, of course, it comes also from the location, that you need to stack the program in a very high building. But does this social idea, this very strong social dimension you have in your project, always work? Do you go there from time to time to see what really happens in these buildings?
Well, we don't go to Lima from time to time. We don't go that often. But we have been there with students, and it is a kind of extraordinary place. And one of the things that the client said to us, which I thought was really interesting, he didn't talk about how grand the spaces were. He just said that he thought that this was a place where every student could find his or her place. So he was thinking about the individual student. In terms of how it works, I think it works well. I think it's a very strong building. Yvonne and I were quite, I'd say it's the first time we were shocked when we went to see a building. When the scaffolding came down, it was just a kind of shock to the system. There are mixed reactions to it in Lima, especially among architects. But what I think is really important is that it's not a glass tower, and Lima is full of glass towers because people really want to be American, and they make these sealed environments. And again, one of our clients was delighted. He's a sailor because the prow of the building picks up the breeze from the Pacific, and they've put in an allowance for air conditioning, but they haven't used it yet because the building cools itself. So from that point of view, it works. I think one of the things we underestimated is that the fog, which is an extraordinary fog because it's when it goes away, it's really hot, and when it's there, it's kind of cool. And there's the moisture on your skin, which makes you feel cold. And I think that combined with concrete makes some people feel cold, even though it's not really cold in terms of temperature, but it's because of the humidity and the fog, and that's also not really understanding the impact of the climate properly. But what we're really happy about, which was the thing we were worried about, is that the building would feel very dark on foggy days. And what we realized is that the light is really strong, even when it's foggy. So that building does not feel dark. It's because we're also really surprised by the difference between fog and Milan, because Milan is really foggy. The day we went to visit the site and we were doing the competition, you could hardly see the time of day. But in Lima, when it's foggy, your eyes hurt because it's refracting the light. So the light is always really strong. So I think, like every building, it works in some areas and then it has problems in other areas. In Toulouse, for instance, the thing that we found extraordinary that everybody loves is because it's like a centrifugal plan. It's not a linear plan, that everybody meets each other every day. And they absolutely love that. I know it's a simple thing, but that thing of making a semi-outdoor space where everybody can meet, that's the serendipity that maybe is needed in universities. One of the things I was thinking when you talk about what are the common things in our projects, I would say to move in fresh air as much as possible. And this comes from the monastic typology, because we think one of the most beautiful places to be is the cloister in a monastery, and the monastery makes a fantastic place of education, which we've all experienced. So it's that thing of being outside and being in fresh air and being able to connect with the bigger world, that affects one's health and one's state of mind. And I think we're at a point now where that's really important, even in cold climates, that you can find ways of making a microclimate where you can still smell the air.
Okay, thank you.
Now for me, it was actually quite interesting to see your fantastic selection of projects. And what I recognized never before was, at least from a personal level, that I had the idea that all these projects you showed made somehow a reference to landscape in a way. Yeah, that had probably also to do with the selection of the images, but. I mean, you showed always this, in the beginning you started with the cliff, but you also showed always these kind of canyon-like spaces, the let's say external circulation, and I think also the interiors you showed very often felt a bit like outside spaces. And for me, I mean, this project have a sort of surprising beauty that is rather, I would say, non-classical. So it's a bit not, let's say, in the, let's say, Renaissance way of working or something like that. And I was wondering, let's say, if these, let's say, in the design process, if there is also an influence maybe of your more direct surrounding. So is this kind of experience of being Irish, living in the Irish, let's say, very beautiful landscape, also have an influence on the design process?
Thank you for your question about the reference to landscape. I think yes, we're lucky to be Irish. We are very aware that we live on an island out in the Atlantic. And it's kind of crazy that Irish architects are did a project in, you know, a city like Lima and won a competition, which we didn't realize that was going to be a possibility. So I think what is fantastic about the place that we all come from, I think we are very aware of that we are human beings. I don't know whether it's cultural. I think, yes, our poets and our writers and our artists and our music is very physical. But we like people as well. I don't think it's just that we live out, that there's green fields outside here and it goes off into the sunset. I think that might be a romantic a view of us here, of 6 million people now on this island in the Republic. And that I think, though, what it does is that we value many things that are cultural, and that we try to weave into an architecture that there isn't the architectural solution, as when you're referring to the kind of a classical, there isn't the thing of beauty. Each project has the potential to be an invention, a new thing, a new story. And that as architects, we build stories with materials. Our words are translated into timber or to concrete or with brick. So we translate. I think it's interesting about translation. When you talk about, being Irish, we speak English as our everyday, but we have another language which is embedded in place, and each field has a name and embedded in the language that's still alive, but we try to keep it alive like a little flame. And that language, architectural language, that what we're dealing with, we say that architecture is a silent language that speaks. And I think that when someone, no matter where you are in the world, and you walk into a space and it holds you or it brings you in and it tells you how to move within itself, how to be contained, how to see out, then that is a language. And that's why we said yes to be invited to speak to students today, because we're trying to share a common language. And I think it's about awareness that architecture is something that we're all trying to understand, and that each project is an experiment. And sometimes some experiments are more successful than others. And schools of architecture, and your question about learning landscapes, is that we're learning. Each project we do, and some bit of it, as Shelly described, is a bit more successful than the other. So we're actually learning. It's a verb as well as just learning as an adjective for education. So yes, we're Irish. We love being Irish, but I think it's more that we are part of an architectural community around the world that's really trying to find ways to make that are sustainable, culturally integrated, that somehow people can read and understand. And that since 2008, because more than half of the world live in urban spaces, what we do as architects is we use the term architecture is the new geography. We have more responsibility now than we did 100 years ago or 200 years ago, because people are living in the things we think up. So we better do them well, because people are going to spend their lives in them. So learning landscapes, architecture is new geography, being Irish or wherever you're from, I think we're part of an architectural community. And it's lovely being Irish, but it's not an excuse.
Would you then go for unlearning landscapes?
Shell, that's your one.
Unlearning. Well, actually, that is an interesting point, because in a way, we have to unlearn in order to discover. And I think that's what's one of the wonderful things about teaching is the questioning. And the wonderful thing about students is fresh minds and not having the baggage. Knowledge is important. It's more than important to all of us. But also what's interesting is when you get a young person with no baggage who asks a question, why can't it be like this or something? And we would like to think that we're always learning, but we're always unlearning. And probably every architect would say that, because it's interesting that our training is to question, to think, in order to question, you have to think, well, what is the question? And unlearning landscapes, that's uncovering. It's kind of uncovering or start again. There's that lovely thing of the way musicians and dancers talk about, we dance each time for the first time. You know, we play each time for the first time. Keith Jarrett talks about that. You know, each time he plays, it's fresh, it's new, it's the first time. He takes a risk. You know, I think learning isn't about being sure, and doubt and questioning takes you to another place. And it's one of the painful things about being an architect is that we're always restless. We're always restless people questioning things and wondering, are we doing the right thing? And is the best solution? And can we do better? You know, so it's not how would you say, a tranquil, comfortable profession in a way. It's a quite turbulent, restless profession. Well, from my point of view, that's me.
One of the things I think that needs to be also part of the discussion is that the context in which architects work, the contracts, the industrialization, the funding, all those kind of things are like whitewater rafting. That we need to give also students the courage to go down those turbulent waters and to find ways of being able to keep the boat afloat, you know, because it's not an easy profession. And sometimes you get the right client and the right place and and things come together in a particular way. I think that, like when Shell was describing the project in Kingston, you know, the awkward site with the busy roads, the car parking out in front, it's also a form of transformation. It's a miracle. I mean, to make a building is like a miracle. You know, all the things come together. So students could be encouraged to be brave, but also tenacity, to have the kindness to listen to people whose voices are never heard. It's a big spectrum, and that the learning landscape or the unlearning landscapes is what's included in the landscape. Is it only oak trees, or is it the cleaning lady down in the distance, or is it the ethos of it that it's interesting? It could be that's an enormous platform, the learning landscapes. You know, what do you hear? You know, even sound. You know, when you're in a group and you can't really hear what somebody's saying, acoustics are a learning landscape. And do we teach acoustics properly? You know, and people are excluded if you can't hear someone making a point. So acoustics and no, it's I think it's a great theme. You could spend 20 years writing chapters on learning landscapes because it's everything. It's material, it's acoustic, it's cultural. No, it's very good. I think it's very good. The typology issue is, I think maybe Shell made the point earlier on, typologies are kind of a bit dangerous because you could be quite sure, you know, I'll pour this particular project into this container because it's fine and it's always been good. So that's a bit dangerous, except that we also use the argument that something like the Ospedale Maggiore, built in the 15th century, is still doing a perfect job. And so talk about sustainability. That's certainly paid back its investors many, many centuries of use. So sometimes it's very useful and sometimes it's dangerous.
About typology, of course, you have to rediscover each time a new type of building. It's not about a recipe that you just use in a schematic way each time anew. That for sure. Is there more questions from the audience? There's no questions in the YouTube. Or is everybody now tired and just a good moment to make the conclusions and to finish our very inspiring discussions and lectures?
Also, because Andre, we have to leave, and we don't want to be rude before we say goodbye, because we have another appointment. I mean,
oh yes,
okay. we can wait. You don't have to finish because of us, but.
No, but I think that the last words they were kind of very good moment to finalize our discussion. So thank you to everybody once again. Yeah, I was intended to do a little summary.
Yes, do. Please. A short one. A short one.
I think we can keep it really very, very short. And I think in our last discussion we kind of summarized a little bit all the main aspects we had in the other discussions and lectures. So and maybe the statement of unlearning landscape is maybe the most inspiring one. So we made a quite interesting tour between very, very strong and strict typological approaches up to a way how you do that, namely to start with very universal qualities and then organize a building following these kind of principles. So for me, the three lectures and the discussions were very very impressive and even overwhelming, I must say. So yes, I have not much more to add to this. And once again, thank you very much. I don't know, Oliver, if you have something to add to that.
I think we are all very inspired, actually. It was a lot of information, and we liked especially that we had very different positions. And I think the truth, like so often, is somehow in the middle. But you also, everybody on his own has to find out what he wants to do. And I think for me, it was very inspiring. I think it was really fantastic. And greetings from Hanover. And thank you very much to all of you.
Greetings from Rotterdam. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.